actually meeting in person. And it didn't make a lot of sense. And at some point, for a bunch of reasons, I think we had a major financial challenge in like 2003, 2004. We said, we're actually going to go all virtual for a year. And we ran the brain-based coaching, which we still run. It's had like 25,000 graduates now. And we ran this completely virtually as an experiment with no in-person. And at the time, we were like, well, we think it could work. It was amazing. We saw no difference in the quality. We're like, how is it you can be on a phone? And by the way, this was, the olden days, I'm that old, where there were phones. No one was on a cell phone. People were on landlines, and we could ask them to be in a landline. There was no platform, right? It was a, freeteleconference.com or something like that. There was, we'd give people a workbook, but it was basically a phone bridge, right? Everyone would be off mute. No one would be allowed to mute. It had to be in a quiet place. But you could hear a pin drop across 24 people. And what we found is that the conversations in many cases were deeper, more impactful, more real, and more meaningful to people than in person. We're like, that's so weird. Like, what is it that's going on? So that was kind of a clue. And then we published the AGES model in 2010 that explained attention, generation, emotion, spacing. And then all this research started to come out. We started working on that about 2007. We published it in 2010. And all this research started to come out about what was called social memory. And we started to see this research that memories can be stored in a way where social information is part of that memory network or not, right? There's some information that's just completely disconnected from other humans in any way, and some information that's really connected to people, like connected to the people you learned it from, right? Or I learned that lesson from my dad, right? Or, so there's a type of memory called social memory. And we wrote about this in the AGES update paper in 2012. And it ended up, that one insight of how powerful social is, ended up having us completely change how we delivered learning and designing a way of doing learning that we still do today that we just never would have imagined without that insight. So it sort of was a really pivotal piece of research about social, but we haven't kind of come back to it in 12 years. So we're like, okay, let's dig deeper into what we've discovered about social learning. But the essence of it is there's something that happens in the brain when you make things social that really changes it. And I'll summarize it, and then we'll go to you, Emma. The summary we sort of came to a few years ago was you encode more deeply. So essentially, you're embedding it deeper in the brain. You recall more easily, so you're able to remember, and you also act more often. And they're three slightly different things. Maybe we'll come back to that at the end, but that's sort of as far as we got. But now we're going to get into the deeper science. So, Emma, finally shut up. What do we mean by social learning? First of all, let's kind of create a foundational definition.
Right. Thanks for that. No, it's a great lead in because we have been talking about it for a long time. And so we've known for a while that social learning and being in a social situation will enhance all of the outcomes. The experience is just richer. And so you can encode a lot deeper. And I think, and I'll cover some of the reasons why this is true, but now we really have an understanding of the neural foundations for why. Like, why is this the case when you have a bunch of people together, either whether they're virtually or in the same room, because both of these can enhance learning. The group themselves, when they're kind of in sync together, will learn better. But social learning by definition is just the learning through observation of others. And so you can set this up in many different ways, but observing or imitating the behavior. And the definition, as we've understood it, has changed a bit over time. And there are many components you can imagine to this, like who are you learning from? When is it happening? Are you passively sitting there and taking it in, or are you actively engaging in the experience? So there are all of these different ways and components, and we'll talk about them as kind of like recipe pieces or the minimal viable product if you want to create kind of like a social engagement, a social learning kind of experience. But that's kind of the general definition of social.
Give it to me in a short sentence. Give it to me like, I don't know if you can do 7 words or less, like we clarified.
I know. Social learning is learning by observing others.
Learning by observing others. Okay.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
And that was good. But you can break this up into 3 main kinds of this, and this is going to help us kind of decide, like design it, right?
Yeah. What are those 3 kinds? Tell us about the sort of the chunks. I love that it's in 3s already. So tell us about the 3 kinds.
I tried. So the first kind is just observational. And you can imagine what this is. You're just watching or listening. And important here is that the information is just flowing in one direction. It's from the teacher or whoever's sharing the information and the learner. And that's very passive. So you're watching a recorded tutorial or you're watching a lecture. And the second is imitation, where you're still watching or listening to someone and you're kind of imitating their behavior or what they're, so it's a little more active, but the information flow is just in one direction. Now, I would say the third type is the one we're really diving into, and that's the interactive learning. This is, I would say, true social learning, where you're interacting with the other individual or others. It could be multiple, and there's a full taking turns of information. So you're sending information, the other person is sending information back, you're reacting, everyone is taking turns, and it's a complete engagement of the whole group.
Right. So it's kind of observing, imitating, interacting. Is that right?
Yeah, observing, imitating, and interacting. And this is kind of increasing in the amount of engagement that the learner is experiencing. But with the third, this is where everyone is engaging. And that's really important to some of the research that we'll say and that we'll cover.
So observing, imitating, interacting, three ones. And what you're saying is there's social learning benefits at each level. But as you go up, like there's social learning benefits at observing, but stronger benefits at imitating and even stronger at interacting. Got it.
Yeah. And I would say that while you can learn at all of these levels, and you can even learn by reading a book. So we know that the learning processes happen, the brain areas are engaged, but the interactive learning, I would say, is a qualitatively different phenomenon that involves a whole different set of cognitive and physiological mechanisms.
Okay, well, let's dig into that. So I think we've all heard that thing and experienced that thing of, you really want to learn something, you teach it, right? Maybe that's an example of really deeply interacting learning, right? Maybe it's the fourth type, I don't know, but there is something about really engaging with people. But tell us what does the research say about that third level, about interactive learning? I'll stop interrupting you, and you can talk about interacting.
You can interrupt me. That's fine. I would first say that a lot of what we're understanding now in this past decade is really due to the fact that we have so much better technology that can allow us to really understand what everyone in the room is, what's happening, especially what's happening in their brain. So some of the research we're going to cover is this multi-brain scanning or this hyper scanning technology, where you can get a group of individuals in the room and you can look at what's going on in their brains all at the same time, which is amazing. And so this is what often happens with neuroscience. And while we've known for a while that social learning and social experiences are critical for outcomes, now we have like the real research to understand why. And so sometimes waiting for the technology to catch up is important. But there are some really interesting studies on the behavioral stuff, like what's happening when you have individuals, adults, like learning in social situations. So for example, you're learning a new language. There's one study that looked at basically what happens when you ask individuals to learn a set of new words, either by an audio translation, so reading the words and hearing the words, versus just watching a social interaction on a screen of two people saying these words back and forth. And almost similarly to how a lot of parents are having their children learn new languages, is they kind of like place them in front of a cartoon of a different language and they start to learn what the words mean. What they found is that in that case, obviously it makes a lot of sense that those individuals that were watching the social interaction learned a lot faster, their accuracy rates were better, and the engagement of the hippocampus and the motor areas, all the areas we know are important for learning, were more highly engaged. So just watching the social interaction, in this case, they weren't even truly engaging in this. That's
really interesting. That's really interesting. So you're saying that third level of, even though is that the third level or is that observing? Now I'm getting confused. Is watching people interacting now interacting social learning or still observing social learning? What do you think?
That's a good question. I would say it's imitating.
It's imitating, right?
Maybe watching and imitating, if they're kind of imitating in the motor areas are engaged a bit, but not truly like the highest level.
Yeah, one thing I see delivering a lot of talks a lot for clients is A client or a company will, bring me on and say, like, we want you to talk about, I don't know, inclusion. And I'll say, look, rather than me talk at people about inclusion, why don't we have a conversation people can watch, right? Now, sometimes I do that because I just don't want to, have to build a deck, and it's just sort of easier. But actually, the main reason that that's better is watching two people have a conversation. I think creates less of a threat response for people because they don't feel talked at. So they're not getting like a status threat of you're telling me I'm doing something wrong, or an autonomy threat of you're telling me what to do, right? If you're watching two people talking, I think your threat is lower and you're more in a towards state, right? Now, in that greater towards state, you have more insight. And so I think there's something to that. So as much as possible, I try to do the sort of fireside chat format. I still end up presenting the same content, but I do it in a way where people feel like I'm watching a conversation. And I saw that for years. I'd present something, and then the Q&A component would be so much more interesting to everyone, including me. So there's something to that. But what you're saying is, it's not just that the threat is lower, it's that watching people interacting activates different brain functions and different brain processes. What do we know about that? Dig into that a little bit more.
Oh, absolutely. So we know for sure that learning will activate all sorts of areas like the hippocampus, like your memory areas, all of those areas, sometimes emotional areas if you're learning something that triggers an emotion. But when you're adding that social component, you're adding a whole other set of brain areas. We call it the social brain. So it's a huge set of areas, the default brain mode, things like that. So now you've created this super rich experience that's now encoded in your brain as anytime anything in that experience is triggered, again, the whole memory is triggered. So obviously then you're going to be able to remember that moment and any piece of that moment much longer. And there's a lot of studies that show that. And actually, another study that I found that actually really looks directly at the virtual component. So we often do our learning virtually. And this specific study looked at all of the different ways you can make the virtual experience social. So a set of individuals just watching a recording, like a tutorial, a set of individuals watching an interaction, and then another set of individuals that were directly interacting with the online instructor. So similar to how you have a live facilitation, but virtually. And you can imagine that those that were interacting learned that material much better, but then also it was sustained for a week later. So the learning was longer as well.
That's really interesting. So what you're saying, there was a study that actually looked at these three types, right? Observational, imitation, interacting. They looked at it. What did they find was the differences? Is there any specific data you could share about those differences? And I think we'll put the link in the chat for folks who want to read. We're going to get nerdy today. We're going to talk about studies. We don't often dig into specific studies, but we're going to get more nerdy today. So my team can put some of the links into to that one. So yeah, thanks very much. And ages, we can maybe explain ages. We've had a lot of events where we've been talking about ages, so we didn't bring it up here, but my team can put some of the relevant readings in there. It's attention, generation, emotion, spacing. It's the four elements that all need to be moderate to high for easy recall under pressure. And that's a measure we think is really important if you're designing learning events today. If you're designing a learning event, you're generally designing something you want people to become their habit, because you can just look stuff up. If it's just informational, you can just look it up, right? So if you're designing something you want as a habit, you need easy recall under pressure. And for that, working backwards, you need pretty high to very high attention, generation, emotion, and spacing with regard to encoding tasks. And it turns out that, interesting, social kind of does all four, but particularly interacting social, that fourth level, right? Because you're paying much more attention when you're interacting with someone than on your own, right? You're generating connections when you're interacting with someone. Your emotions are higher interacting with someone. And then if you continue to see that person, you'll reanimate the networks that you formed, right? So in a sense, social creates really strong ages as well. So yeah, so back to studies. We were talking about the study that showed kind of the difference in the three. What kind of data did we find in there? What came up?
Well, I know I can't actually remember exactly what they were teaching them, but it was the learning itself was, so when they tested them immediately after the session, so those that had that direct interaction recalled all of the information that was learned immediately much better. And then they brought them back a week later. And so this was a study that actually didn't do any kind of like underlying neural data, which we'll get into, but this was purely behavioral. But it does say something really interesting about when you're designing virtually, if the facilitator is interacting with the group, whether it's one-on-one or whether it's in a group, like that has the benefits. And I think AGES is necessarily integrated into all of that.
Right. So the headline is Get Interacting.
Yeah.
Get interacting. And thanks, folks, putting chats and comments in the chat. Love those. Keep those coming. It's a type of interaction. Your brain will wonder if it's going to be seen and then get a little delight when the comment's seen. And yeah, so definitely let's interact in the chat about this. So let's dig deeper. What do we know about what's happening in the brain? And sort of how do we think about what's happening in the brain, particularly in that, well, I guess in all three, but particularly in that interacting level. You mentioned the word synchrony. Can you talk us through that and kind of take us a couple of clicks into that?
Yeah. This is the stuff that I really love. And actually, this is the stuff that's most interesting right now and is totally dependent on the fact that we have the technology that we can do this now. So I'll just give you the takeaway is basically that when you have a group of people together and their brains are in sync, their learning outcomes are going to be better. So when the group is in sync, then you can take an individual and what they've learned is better, which is just kind of a fascinating result. That means the group has to be aligned, focused on the same thing. And a lot of this has come from being able to record the electrical activity of multiple people at the same time in the learning situation, moment to moment learning, which is really fascinating. So it's what we call hyperscanning EEG. It's this new kind of technology. You're basically putting like an electrical reading cap on and you're letting them learn. And one of the pieces of this, I'm going to a little bit click deep in here. One of the pieces of this is something we call an alpha wave. It's just a kind of waveform. And when that waveform is in sync, we often think that's related to attention. And so the group is highly focused on each other and on the topic. And this also involves the teacher, which I think is amazing. In a lot of these situations, the teacher is also part of this group. So they're all focused on each other.
Interesting. Yeah, someone's asking about NSYNC. We don't mean the band.
I was
But it's funny how the brain creates connections. And we there's a thing called neural synchrony, which is essentially like you imagine two violins near each other and you play an A on one violin, the other violin actually plays like resonates with the same note. Interestingly, so there's a kind of synchrony. So synchrony is like, in some ways, my Luddite brain understands it as two brains kind of like humming at a similar frequency, similar brain networks active. And they're studying synchrony now. Now, is this similar or different to FNIRS, which is a really interesting new technology? So the technology you're talking about, is it the same or different as FNIRS? Folks might have heard about.
I'm actually not quite sure about the details of that, but this is the EEGs are a bit more surface level, and the benefit of them is that they're super temporal resolute, meaning that you can study moment to moment exactly what they're learning. What was the context of that sentence and what was happening in the brains right then. And that's the benefit of that. And the studies are fascinating because what they have actually shown is that you can have a group of 5 recording at the same time, teacher and students, and moment to moment recall is best when they're most in sync, both at the time and even a week later. So this is highly related to that, like direct interaction and sustained learning.
So synchrony is correlating to easy recall under pressure.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So what do we know about synchrony in the brain during learning? Like what brain regions are engaged? Like what does it look like? Or is it any brain region and it's just synchronized? What do we know?
Yeah, so what you can really tell from this kind of data is really just that like large scale brain areas are kind of in sync. And what you can imagine is a lot of the brain regions are kind of focused on the same concept. We think this is associated with like attention. So when their attention is highest all at the same time, they're probably focused on each other and on the content. And actually one study looked at 12 individuals. So I know somebody asked about the group size. They've even studied this in a group size of like 12 students over the course of like a set of biology lectures. And they found that the days when individuals were most engaged and focused on the content, regardless of the teaching style, so the teaching style might have changed, the the most synchrony happened when everyone was focused and engaged on the same day. So it's just amazing that sometimes it might depend, your outcome as an individual might depend on how in sync the group is together.
Right.
So you
So
benefit from
it's
others.
not so much about like one particular brain region being in sync. It's about the quality of attention. You're saying that when
Yeah.
everyone's attention is focused on the same thing. So their attention could be focused on a memory, right? Or their attention could be focused on an external stimuli, or their attention could be focused on a sound. But basically, it's their attention is focused on the same thing, and it could be any kind of different brain network. It's about a
Yeah.
correlation of attention in a way. What do you think happens? What do they know about what happens when attention is synchronized like that? What are some of the downstream effects?
Well, the downstream effects will absolutely be that the brain areas that are needed for forming new connections, so like the hippocampus with the emotional brain areas and all the memory networks that you're forming, you're more likely just to form better synapses, better connections. And we know that the best memories are those that have the strongest connection. So that old statement, if you wire together, you fire together. So the more often and the strongest these connections are kind of like firing together at the same time, the more likely you're going to form that really strong connection. And
I actually just think you had a massive breakthrough without noticing it. The statement is actually cells that fire together, wire together. I think
oh, that's right.
you just invented humans that fire together, wire together.
Yeah.
Congratulations on coining a phrase. Humans that fire together, wire together.
The thing recorded.
Yeah, I'm writing it down. I'm going to even say Emma. There you go. So it's interesting. You heard it first from Emma. Humans that fire together, wire together. So it's an attention thing. So it's almost like when you're paying attention to something, the attention has a certain intensity. But when you're paying attention to something and other people are paying attention to it as well, the intensity, the attention density itself is stronger. Like the amount of attention is stronger because others are as well. And this explains, I guess, this explains a lot of things. Like watching a recorded webinar is so much less effective than being there live, even though you might just be watching it, but you're sensing other people watching at the same time, right? So there's a term, attention density. I haven't used it for a long time, but when I was working with Jeffrey Schwartz years ago, when we wrote the Neuroscience of Leadership, the first paper on this space, and he helped me with Your Brain at Work. When I was working with Jeffrey, he talked a lot about attention density, and we started to give it metrics. And essentially, it's the intensity of attention multiplied by the time that you're spending. So you could have over a day, you could have like very high attention density, but it might be in 5 seconds bursts. Many times. That might be much more effective than spending an hour on something where you're vaguely paying attention. So attention density seems to be increased. Basically, when other people are paying attention to the same thing, you're all kind of really, really focused on it. That's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the reasons why social learning is so effective is that we are so sensitive to the group, and especially if it's a group, and we'll talk a bit about this, but especially if the group is kind of your team, you're in group, you have this social relatedness between them, that social closeness. And there's actually research that shows this, that as the social closeness between like a student and a teacher, for instance, increases. So you can imagine this between like you and your teammate, as that becomes stronger, you have a greater chance of becoming in sync in your neural activity. So it just makes the process even easier.
That's so fun. I have to tell you a funny thing. Emma reaches out to me sometimes and says, I found this fantastic research. I want to talk to you about it. And today, this was one of those examples where I said, great, let's talk about it with an audience, because lots of people paying attention will make this even more interesting to both of us. And that's what's happening. So this is my ulterior motive is I really wanted to unpack this research. And we said, let's do it with more attention. So that's very, very, very meta right there. But what I'm seeing is observational, imitational, and interactive social learning. Basically, as you go up, you're increasing the attention density. That's kind of what's happening, and that attention density is one of the elements of ages. So you're really increasing the attention, and you'd have to imagine emotional impact is going up a lot as you're going from observational to interaction, right? Because there's stakes when you're interacting. So emotions going up, and attention. So and probably generation as well, because I don't know if they've studied this, but I know when you think about an idea and then speak about it with someone, when you speak it out loud, It's like you process it differently. The way I don't think anyone studied this directly, maybe they have, but the way I've always understood it is the concept of spreading activation, which is a neuroscience term. And essentially, you think an idea, you might have 1 million neurons involved, but when you speak it, now you've got billions of neurons involved, so that the network for the idea is more robust. And as a result, it can connect to other things that wouldn't have connected to more. So speaking to others versus just thinking it enables you to like bridge connections you wouldn't have made because that core network is stronger. So to me, social also is increasing this spreading activation of ideas in your own brain. So now we're at attention, generation, and emotion across the board. So so back to you. Let's get practical. So what do we know? We know it's a lot about attention. It's a lot about synchrony. What do we know about like really making something social? What do we know about kind of from the research? What have we known about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are definitely like the baseline of what do you need to learn in general, right? You need like the normal things like attention, motivation. You need like a bit of social arousal, or like you're engaged with this group. You need the why of why am I here, the importance of this for me. So some of that comes from just being in a social group. But then there's also the like, how are you connecting with this individual? Are you able to read their cues? So are you seeing their face, their social cues? Because a lot of and you were mentioning this before, as you're talking, when you talk about an idea, you're engaging more of your brain because you're talking about it to somebody else, but then also you're taking a bit of perspective of this person. You understand this person and their expectations a bit, and that is going to change how you're explaining something. So if you're talking to a void and you're just recording yourself, you have no idea of the audience that's in the room, but having an audience, you're talking to one person or a group, and take that into account too. So that changes the message. And then their feedback changes what you understand about it. And so it's this constant, this back and forth of information that involves this super rich social environment. So the more that you have, whether you see their face or just their hands, whether it's live or recorded, all of those things matter. But then all of the group dynamics too. So are you attending to the same thing? Do you have like a common ground or like a set of social expectations of this group? So like within a team, are you able to take perspectives of the others? Is there a sense of relatedness? Is there a shared goal with the group? Yeah. So all of these things are so important for just building a team. And you can imagine if you have a team and you're learning together, you might have all of those things in place. So you can imagine that the learning that you do together might even be fostered.
Yeah, you've got me thinking about something. So we'll take some questions in a minute. I think if you want to have a quick look through the questions, there are some things that jump out to you. But just what you're reminding me of is some research we did a few years ago on like kind of we dug a couple of clicks deeper into the effects of diverse teams. And those diverse teams had to be inclusive to get these benefits. But when the team was diverse and inclusive, you basically had a higher team IQ. And we published this in HBR in a piece called Why Diverse Teams Are Smarter. So you have this higher team IQ, which can be measured and is stable across time for a team, as long as you had diversity and inclusion. But what was interesting, we dug into the mechanism of that at one point to try to understand, like, well, exactly how does this happen? And I'm starting to see some parallels. And we saw there's a whole body of research on what's called cognitive elaboration. And we wrote a piece on this. My team can maybe dig it up. So cognitive elaboration is like a click deeper into why diverse teams are actually smarter. And essentially, it's that you work harder to explain yourself to quite different brains if you have different brains there. Like if you have people who just, group think like you have people who think like you, when you explain something, you just explain it one way, the way you always have. Add a different person, maybe a brand new person to your company, you've got to cognitively elaborate your idea now. You've got to like work harder to explain it the way a new person would understand it. Now add a person from a completely different socioeconomic construct. Now add a person who speaks a second language. And wow, that was fast, Evan. Thanks. And now you're really having to elaborate. And what happens is you're basically putting in much more effort. And as a result of that effort is that you see more flaws in the thinking, you explain it better. And then there's the second half of that cognitive elaboration is people challenge you more, right? So provided there's psychological safety in that group setting, you get really rich cognitive elaboration, which is essentially sort of breaking down ideas and really working on them together. And that's what happens. So I guess in social learning, the same kind of thing is happening. That's one of the elements that's happening, is you're getting that cognitive elaboration. In good social learning, where there's space to debate and argue and sort of really, really challenge each other as well. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, it's such a great point. And you can just imagine, because what everyone brings to the table is, as long as everyone feels that they are included and able to speak up, then everyone brings all of these social expectations, these experiences, because they're all part of our memories and what we've learned. And, just in terms of like what it applies to, it applies to all kinds of learning, whether you're learning how to do something like a process, whether you're learning an idea or some kind of just like general knowledge. It's definitely it applies to all of that, because you're forming a network. And so the more rich your network is, then the better you understand a concept. And this kind of comes up when you're teaching too. I mean, when you're teaching something, you're learning, because you have to understand like what level individuals are coming in at, what is their experience. Starting from scratch forces you to go through like the foundations of the context and explain it maybe for the first time. Maybe even if you didn't understand the foundation from the beginning, you just understood the outcomes, that you have to go from the beginning. And it absolutely ties to psych safety for sure.
Yeah,
That's
interesting.
definitely part of that. Yeah.
I have some questions for you, but I'm going to be more inclusive and ask some questions from the group. There's a couple of questions jumping out that we can maybe both discuss. One from Bonnie, talking about mandatory versus voluntary learning, right? She's saying, experience mandatory is less desirable. We actually wrote a piece on this as it relates to DEI training, showing fairly conclusively that mandatory DEI training probably makes things worse, and that you just don't want to do it. We wrote a pretty significant piece in Strategy and Business years ago. My team can put in, and the cliff note there is the sort of autonomy threat people feel, like being told they have to do something, and the status threat, like, oh, you're broken, you need this class. And particularly in the DEI space, very few people feel, have a felt sense that they're doing something wrong with DEI. And when they feel blamed, they get defensive. So, but it's not just that space. And I guess the more people are told they have to do something, the less social the learning will be, the less they'll speak up, the less they'll challenge each other. How would you process that? Mandatory versus, we talk about mandatory versus compelling learning, right? So we try to create compelling, not just mandatory. But what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, you could think about it in so many ways. I mean, you could even bring SCARF into this as well. I mean, having the engagement. So this maybe relates to like the general arousal or the saliency of the experience, that you're interested in it, you're motivated by it. You won't feel any of those things if you feel like you're being forced against your will towards something. You lose that sense. You're in a state of threat or avoidance. So you just won't be able to learn. And that just puts a big barrier. Yeah.
So that gets to a point from Wendy. And in fact, we thought about this a few years ago. It was the summit, I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. We did a quick kind of touch in on social learning. And that's where we came up with encode more deeply, recall more easily, act more often. So we released that maybe 3 or 4 summits ago. But I remember at the time that some of our researchers, I think it was Cami, who was with us for a few years, actually challenged our thinking and said, look, social learning isn't good. Actually, social learning can be bad if you don't have the right social environment. So if you have, like there are situations where social learning can be worse than non-social learning, but learning on your own might be better than social. And if, for example, people feel bullied by people in the classroom, right, they probably learn better on their own. That's an obtuse example, but there definitely are situations where social learning, won't make learning better. So there's a kind of proviso here that, social learning with good psychological safety, or, social learning with a positive environment increases ages, but it might actually decrease ages if the social isn't managed the right way. So I think that's an important kind of call out. Any questions that you want to jump into there as well?
No, that makes a lot. I think that's a great point. And I think that requires us to think about the environment that we're setting up and who is sharing the information. And it also relates, and something that's coming up to me is like just the different kinds of like learning platforms. I mean, we've been talking about like virtual sessions and having like a live facilitator, but this kind of learning can also happen on something like social media too. It's the same idea, is that you are learning from each other. It may be asynchronously, but you're engaging, you're responding, you're seeing other kinds of reactions. And one of the reasons why those kinds of platforms are so interesting for individuals and engaging is because they're able to see the social feedback from something that they're sharing, the information that they're sharing. And maybe one of the benefits of those kinds of social learning platforms is that the information is there forever. So it's not contained within a room of whoever's included in this room at this time. Everyone can jump into this social platform at any time and see the information, learn it, react to it. So it's kind of continuous. So there are benefits of having a platform where you're learning asynchronously as well. And that can kind of like boost learning in a different way. You might not have the visual reactions, but you have like some of the social reactions, the emotional reactions.
Yeah, let's get into that. I just put in a chat, my team put in the chat a link to one of the events that we did on this, but I also put the strategy and business piece. It took me a minute to remember the title. It's a couple of years old, but is your company's diversity training making you more biased, was the piece. And it's a really important piece based on some other research that came out at the time about just really don't make learning mandatory. That's the cliff note. Don't make learning mandatory. And then rather than just make it like, voluntary, which isn't great, right? What you want to do is make it compelling. And really, really think about what makes learning compelling. We ran some summit sessions on this over the years, like how do you get from mandatory to compelling and what's that look like? And I think it continues to be a really important piece of work. All right, what other questions we got here? Some fun questions. Folks, put your questions in, or comments or insights, all really interesting. Let me see if there's some other ones. Otherwise, maybe let's go to sort of what you started talking about. I'm curious about this, Emma. What's the minimum viable product for making social learning and maybe for interactional social learning, right? That third piece, not observational, but imitational. What's that third piece? What's the minimum viable product to make that work?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a number of things, and as some of the studies that we showed, there are different levels, and you're always going to get maybe enhanced and longer lasting learning if there's some social component. So we even saw with some of those studies, just watching social interactions is beneficial because there are people engaging in your reactions and stuff. So maybe it's watching social interactions. If someone is more of an introvert and they don't actually want to engage themselves, they can watch that. Or maybe asynchronously engaging in a conversation where they're able to think and then respond and then share their emotional reaction and then see others responding the next day. So those like social platforms as well. So I think the ability to see like a bi-directional information flow, like share your information, get some reaction to that from somebody else, so then you can change your perspective and then respond. That back and forth, like taking turns, I would say is like the most minimal.
Back and forth, right?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
And so can that be asynchronous? Does that have to be real time, or can it be asynchronous?
Yeah, I absolutely can be asynchronous. And we've been experimenting with this itself, but that's what I was saying about the social media in a way, like that's asynchronous and it can be very engaging. And you can form these networks with individuals by jumping back in, reacting, seeing how people react to your information and how you've shared it and having debates that way. You can learn pretty richly in those environments.
I was just flashing on a scene from a show I've been watching lately called Loudermilk, which is a kind of crazy, like one of those shows where people aren't like being shot and dying and like, so it's not stressful. You can watch it to unwind, but it's actually about an AA coach who's working with a group of misfits, and it's just like a nice, relatively easy, funny. But in one scene, there's basically the group, the AA group, had been causing some noise in the neighborhood, and one of the group goes online and starts interacting with the sort of people who are complaining and just blows everything up. And suddenly there's like people picketing and just, so like people clearly can get worked up, like can have strong emotions, right? And pay high attention, right? In asynchronous communication. And you see that with the sort of flaming effect. So it's a really funny situation. So yeah, we've been experimenting with that, and we've always held really firm to the fact that we're not a content organization, that we're a change organization. We started in coaching, and now we're in organizational change, but we're in the behavior change business, not the sort of content business, right? And we really waited a long time to go more digital. Our distributed learning solutions are, very, very scalable, but not completely digital. But this new platform we've built, some of you will have heard of this, the habit activation platform, is a completely new type of learning platform, and it's as different to a normal LMS is as an LMS is to like just PowerPoint. And essentially what we're betting on is that you can get really strong social activation if you're getting people to interact about the right kinds of things, like about the quality of their insights or about the actions that they're planning to take, and committing to those kinds of actions. So there's certain conversations you can get people to have asynchronously, on a platform that will engage them. And it's not just the sort of competitive stuff. It's more about sort of sharing insights, sharing learning, but there's nuances to the way to do that. So we're doing this experiment. Can we do something really asynchronously that makes it social, but also creates insight, over time? And we've launched our first solution in the HAP called Lead. My team can put that in, but we're also going to be putting all of our major solutions as a 30-day sprint in this platform. So we're making a bet that we can do completely digital learning that's more powerful than putting people in a workshop. So we're picturing a 30-day, very asynchronous, like about an hour of experience over a month, spread over a month. That's going to be better than putting them in a one-day classroom for behavior change. And we're starting to get some data on that, but it's a crazy idea, and certainly most digital learning doesn't do anything like that. But we think by following the science of insight and following the science of social, that's going to be possible. So yeah, my team could put a link that we've opened Lead to the public. So you can actually register and do the 6-month Lead program online and start to experience that. And my team can put that in the chat. So anyway, so minimum viable product is really sort of feeling like you're interacting with another person, but doesn't have to be real time. Like feeling like that they're there and feeling like something matters and there are other people there in the process.
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, like we said before, you can absolutely learn in like a unidirectional information, reading a book or listening to a lecture, but seeing how people react to your information and your answers and having that back and forth will change your brain in totally different ways. It's just a totally different phenomenon, and it can lead to just like a more sustainable learning.
Yeah, and that's interactional level. That's not observational imitation. You can actually have an interactional level of social learning. But I think there has to be some stakes in those interactions, not just a thumbs up on a, there has to be some kind of stakes in that.
Yeah. I would say, I mean, you can absolutely respond with a thumbs up, but I think the learning will be a lot richer if you are sharing how you feel. Like, what is your experience with what someone shared? What did that make you think of? There's a bit of that metacognition and sharing experiences that will just increase the overall learning, right? You get that like richer experience.
Yeah, interesting. Let's thanks for the comments. Thanks for the comments here. A couple more questions, then we'll wrap up. But Bonnie's question: the IT department has a soap opera type of training to try to make their mandatory training more compelling. I don't know. Does making arsenic taste better? Better for you, or is it just still, I don't know. I think attempts to make really mandatory things, vaguely funny, maybe hits a few people once. It's like those. The problem is you got to keep doing it differently. Like I think about the safety, briefings on airplanes, right? Like if you go to, sometimes an airline will do a really clever one, and the first time you see it, it's great, but you have to see it like 19 more times before you see a new one, and you're just so over it. So I don't know. I think just don't make it mandatory and find other ways to get the message out that's more compelling, or keep it as short as possible and as fluent as possible versus try to make it, bells and whistles. That would be my sense. So yeah. So what else is coming up for you in the questions? We'll take one or two more and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, the questions have been amazing. There's a lot going on here, but there are some great questions on, level of like interaction that an individual you know, we all have different levels of like social arousal that we can really handle and want, right? So I think that, you know, making the variety of this kind of interaction, it doesn't always have to look the same, right? And so you can do that asynchronous learning and get kind of the benefit, or you can jump into a live session with, you know, in the same room and have all of this rich discussion. So there are definitely differences, right? And it can be a group of 2 or a group of 20. So you can also change, you can also get this rich outcome from just working with someone new and sharing experiences with someone new. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, really interesting. All right, a couple of really quick announcements, then we're going to let people drop. If my team has a poll, let's throw that up now. But a couple of quick announcements. Speaking of social learning, the summit is planned and hold the dates, 29th and 30th of October. We are doing it virtually, but it's going to be highly interactive. You're going to get benefits. Hopefully, we'll be back to in person next year, but we want to do a really different idea this year. We experiment every year. We're doing pretty much around the clock for 2 or 3 days because we're doing a live version in North America, a live version in EMEA, and a live version in APAC with a lot of crossover all at the same time. If Emma looks like she's crying right now, that's because she's managing that. It's going to be very social, but the math of that is, I have a hypothesis that we're not built for time zones very well. But anyway, so we're doing kind of around the clock for 2 or 3 days, depending on how you define day, you know, in 29th and 30th of October. And the amazing thing about virtual is we can have exactly the right scientists and presenters there. So 29th and 30th, even though you're not certain you can be there, try to keep your calendar open as much as you can for that. We had an amazing group. The other thing with that is if you've got, you know, folks in your organization, it's quite cheap to get there, under $500, and you can get a whole team of people there along, or get your company to buy corporate membership so you can get a bunch of folks along and get access to tons of resources. It's a good time to do that. So the summit is coming up. We've got lots of things. You're really interested in the science. The certificate in foundations of neuroleadership is a much loved program. We're doing that 3 times a year now. It's a 6-month online course to really dig deep as an individual practitioner into the science. It's a really phenomenal program. The other thing is the brain-based coaching, roughly once a month. We're kicking off that as well. I think, yeah, lead is exciting. You can now join that anytime and start anytime. We are seeing some early data, some early results from that's exciting, but we're not ready to publish. But you can jump into lead and other things there. Emma, thanks so much for being here. I think we're going to have to do this again where I ask you questions. Let's ask everyone. Let's make this interactive learning. And what topics would you like to hear more about on the science? Let's get some ideas in the chat from the 173 of you still here. What topics would you like to hear more about? And as you're thinking, I'll just remind you, we also just released the white paper on Niles, which my team can throw in the chat a link to that. But we just released the Niles white paper, which is about our amazing AI work. Thanks, Paolo, for being first. Coaching people. And yeah, let's get in the chat some topics you'd like us to dig into the science of more. And yeah, if you want the white paper, put white paper in the chat. Learning in the context of adversarial relationships. That's an easy one.
Performance management. We're going to be covering a lot of performance management at the summit too.
Yeah, we've got a lot on performance management for sure coming up. I think we're digging more into that. So yeah, any topics you want us to dig into the science of more? AI and neuroplasticity. We haven't done an update on basically how attention changes the brain for a long time.
Yeah.
I think it's a really interesting one. There's new studies on that. And attention, neuroplasticity, that's kind of a foundational one. I think it's really important. Celeste is saying the healthy mind platter on what we're seeing, what's new in that. That's a good one. Leaders and their blind spots. That's lots to talk about there. Yeah. Excellent. I'll give folks another minute to do that and see if we can have any insights about topics that would be really interesting to you. And I don't know, can people like others? So maybe, I don't know if you can in this platform or not.
Not sure if you can in this platform.
Yeah, it's a shame. It'd be nice to get some quick votes on that. But performance management, neurodiversity. All right, fantastic. So lots of great comments. Emma, thanks so much for being here. And thanks for messaging me a month or so ago and saying all this amazing research coming out about social learning and taking my challenge that we don't talk about it until we have an audience. And I love what we found. I think these 3 types of learning of social learning are really important. Observational, imitational, interactional. understanding that it's attention density that's the active ingredient. It's really, really helpful. And then even clicking further into that about sort of what creates the attention density, cognitive elaboration, and other things. So yeah, really great conversation. Thanks everyone for being here. This will go up on the podcast in the next couple of weeks. Lots of great sessions on the podcast if you haven't seen it. And otherwise, just thanks for being here. And a big thanks to the team behind the scenes for being here. And if you are interested, I forgot to say, if you are interested in lead for your organization, just put the word lead and your company name, and someone will follow up. That is going into quite a few organizations now, particularly if you're a dispersed company, like people everywhere. It's really phenomenal. So put lead and your company name in the chat, and someone will follow up with you about that. So thanks very much, everyone, for being here. We'll leave the chat open for my team to manage for a couple of minutes if you have any other questions. Otherwise, yeah, just thanks so much, Emma and the team. Take care. Bye-bye.